Alright, let's cover the Munk Debate, which is what I intended to do yesterday. But let's try and actually address the topic, which was barely touched during the actual debate. So, okay, so here's who was involved and what I think the main salient moments of the debate were.
Be it resolved, what you call political correctness, I call progress. Please welcome to the stage, he's an award-winning writer, scholar, broadcaster on NPR and sports networks across America, Michael Eric Dyson. Michael's debating partner is also an award-winning author. She's a columnist at the New York Times and someone who is going to bring a very distinct and powerful perspective tonight. Michelle Goldberg. Michelle, come on out. Against our resolution, be it resolved, what you call political correctness, I call progress, is the Emmy Award-winning actor, screenwriter, author, playwright, journalist, poet, and tonight debater, Stephen Fry. Stephen's teammate is a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, a YouTube sensation, and the author of the big new international bestseller, 12 Rules for Life. Ladies and gentlemen, Toronto's Jordan Peterson.
So that's who we're dealing with, but what were the main kind of highlights? What were the moments that really defined that debate on political correctness?
So we should first decide what we're talking about. We're not talking about my views of political correctness, despite what you might have inferred from the last speaker's comments.
I've been given huge grief already simply because I'm standing here next to Professor Peterson, which is the very reason that I am standing here in the first place. I'm standing next to someone with whom I have, you know, differences, shall we say, in terms of politics and all kinds of other things.
You know, one of the best-selling and most prominent intellectuals in the world right now says in an interview that maybe if women don't want the workplace to be sexualized, they shouldn't be allowed to wear makeup.
I didn't
right?
say that.
Well, Google it.
It
was a Vice interview. Google it.
In chess, the best move to play in chess is not the best chess move. It's the move your opponent least wants you to play. At the moment, you're being recruiting sergeants for the right. By annoying and upsetting, and instead of fighting, either fighting or persuading. But political correctness is a middle course that simply doesn't work.
Why the rage, bruh? You're doing well, but you're a mean, mad white man. And you're gonna get us right. And I have never seen so much wine and snowflaking. There's enough wine in here to start a vineyard.
As you can see, there was very little of the debate that actually tackled the topic. Instead, it strayed into all manner of other tangentially related issues and a lot of personal attacks on Jordan Peterson. Now, it's necessary to preface my further comments by saying that I am no fan of Jordan Peterson. I think he's a snake oil salesman. But I think that many men and many people in society who are now becoming marginalised, in no small part due to the narrative that they're not marginalised, I think he appeals to them, and that's someone who really isn't that great a communicator, and whose views I do find questionable. That he can get such traction, that he can attract such a following, just demonstrates the paucity of good role models and people speaking to these disaffected groups, and that's kind of a tragedy. Now, most of them spent no time really whatsoever trying to tackle the topic. Stephen Fry was really the only honest person involved in this debate, the only one who I felt was speaking to the topic, and the only one who I felt any kind of respect for by the end of it. I mean, Peterson, you saw him struggling to define the terms of the debate, which everyone else ignored. Mr. Dyson there was described later by Stephen Fry as a huckster, and he definitely is. His rhetorical style was entirely, pretty much, personal attacks and jokes, and the odd joke is okay. Stephen Fry was a comedian. He knows how to make people laugh, but he went about it in a much more classy fashion. So really you had two snake oil salesmen, Stephen Fry, who was honestly trying to talk about things, and a woman who was constantly misrepresenting Peterson. That's why I included the Google it phrase, because here's the problem as I see it on a more broad scale around Jordan Peterson. People are smearing him by saying he's far right or a darling of the far right or whatever else. They're saying that he has said these things that he hasn't in fact said. So if you did follow her advice and you did Google it, you would, if you had any diligence whatsoever, you would discover that Peterson didn't say anything of the sort. And when you see Peterson being misrepresented as this darling of the far right, of this he is traditionalistic, but I don't think he's archly traditionalistic. But if you lie about him and then people go and they investigate and they look into him as he actually is, they're not going to trust you. And if you've lied to them about Peterson, then they're going to start to wonder if you've lied about other people that you say are far right, alt-right, whatever else, and they may go and investigate them and they may listen to them, and they've lost their trust in you, and they've gained trust in these figures who they now see as being maligned. Now, I don't think that's automatically going to brainwash them into following, alt-right figureheads, the far right as a whole, but it is going to make them more sympathetic to their position. It is going to make them see that they're being misrepresented, and that's likely to result in greater sympathy and greater traction for the far right, the genuine far right, not the Jordan Petersons, but the actual right-wing, archly conservative figureheads. They're much more likely to get traction. And that is what Stephen was getting at when he was saying that you're being a recruiting tool for the right. Your fixation upon identity politics is going to raise the spectre of identity politics that you don't agree with. White identity, male identity, and so on. Neither of which have to be toxic. It is possible to have positive and constructive versions of those identities, and that's some of what Peterson is trying to do. And while I think that Peterson is a snake oil salesman, I would far rather people took his snake oil than that of someone genuinely on the far right, like David Duke or whatever. He's kind of a last gasp safety net, I think, from preventing people getting to that point. But okay, since they didn't really deal with the subject, and since I've covered what the problem is with the way that a lot of these people are attacking Peterson and misrepresenting him, let's actually talk about political correctness.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. Our chief weapon is surprise. Surprise and fear. Fear and surprise. Our two weapons are fear and surprise and ruthless efficiency. Our three weapons are fear and surprise and ruthless efficiency and an almost fanatical devotion to the Pope.
Political correctness predates the term political correctness. The earliest form of it was probably religious, the idea that certain terms could only be used by certain people or in certain contexts, or that you could take the Lord's name in vain. So it was a kind of blasphemy, I suppose. If you weren't the right kind of person, then the name of God had no place in your mouth, for example, so you couldn't say Jehovah.
I'd had a lovely supper, and all I said to my wife was, that piece of halibut was good enough for Jehovah. Blasphemy! He said it again!
The whole thing continued for some time without being given a name, and then in the early part of the 20th century it gained a name, political correctness, and was used to refer to adherence, strict adherence, massive ideological adherence to particular political orthodoxies. So, for example, and this is not hyperbole, Nazi Germany would say that only people with politically correct views or who had expressed politically correct opinions could hold positions or could be trusted in the Nazi government, and similar things were said in the Soviet Union under Stalin, and that was what it was associated with. It has always been associated with a kind of authoritarian clamping down on people's language.
Should we investigate? Should you shut the fuck up before you get us both killed?
The spectre of political correctness would next rear its ugly head on the right, in relation to the Vietnam War and in relation to Richard Nixon. In that context, political correctness became not so much what you weren't allowed to say, but replacement terms that would obfuscate and make more palatable certain nastier aspects of war. A lot of this was laid down and kind of commemorated in a book called The Unholy Hymnal. You may remember a scene in Full Metal Jacket where the term sweep and clear was used to replace seek and destroy. But my personal favourite politically correct term for things that happened during the Vietnam War was the term preemptive counterattack, or which meant ambush. And I think we can see how that bears relation to some politically correct language that came a bit later on. As the 60s and 70s gave way to the 80s, political correctness kinda, sorta disappeared, but not quite. There were a lot of right-on comedians, but the establishment at the time was very right-wing. So their breaking of social and societal norms was seen as an act of protest or of revolution or of pushing for positive change, pushing against these kind of things. Here in the UK, there was Section 28, which was Thatcher's government's attempt to prevent the supposed promotion of homosexuality, lesbianism, bisexuality, and other sexual identities and proclivities across the country to children. Because think of the children. That was probably about as close as we got during that period, anyway.
Is anyone not unanimous?
We're slightly, what's the opposite of unanimous?
Tell him, Nero. Unanimous? Wrong! The opposite of unanimous is fired!
Then we were hit with the first wave of what we would really recognise as political correctness. Because, oh boy, it was the 90s.
Hey, yo, slam your eyeballs against this. I was sneaking in people and scoping the scene, you know, comping a major toot. When I cut loose this bunch of dweebs, whoa, I've been trying to teach them some rude. Dog, that is.
In the 90s, it was all about softening terms that you might use to describe someone with some disability or who wasn't particularly good at anything. It was a more charitably minded version of the kind of Vietnam-era language that attempted to soften and make more palatable what was going on, though it made absolutely no difference there as to who was getting shot, blown up, or swept and cleared. In this case, it was things like, okay, you're not a retard, you're differently intelligent. You're not in a wheelchair, you're movement challenged, things like this. It was absurd, because all that happened is that people started adopting that language in a sneering tone to mean exactly the same thing. So you might find yourself being called a differently abled, mobily challenged person by some bully in the playground or whatever else, and everyone knew what was meant, just like if I went into a far-right meeting and shouted, "You're all a bunch of fornicating vaginas," they would know perfectly well what they were meant. And these attempts to police this language just meant that people moved to using other terms, either using the politically correct terms in an insulting manner, or shifting to using other terms, which meant that those other terms, which were previously perfectly innocent language, then started getting labelled as dog whistles. Until such a point as basically you can't even have the conversation at all without being assumed to be racist, even when you were using their terms. Eventually that kind of level of extremity petered out and came to an end, and then that brings us around to today.
You know what, that thing where you're eating a meal but you're not really eating a meal, you're just kind of picking at food on the counter. My family and I were doing that one night, and I just kind of looked at them and said, hey guys, I'm non-binary. I don't have a gender.
The political correctness of today very much feels to me, and probably to a lot of other veterans of the 90s, it probably feels like a rerun of what we had then. And it kind of is, but it's a lot worse in a lot of ways. In the 90s it was social pressure, and it was new, and it wasn't entrenched in academia or in media. Even the left-wing media would make fun of it. Even comedians on the left would make fun of the idea of policing and twisting and using language, which is probably why a lot of lefty comedians, you know, from that era with longer careers are now finding themselves butting up against it and being very confused, Stephen Fry amongst them. What it has now that it didn't have then is teeth. Not just in the social sphere, which has become far more vicious. It's become possible to socially impose these things on people, but also in terms of corporate policy, in terms of academia and the whole apparatus and structure around that, even in law. Now, I was with Peterson in his objections to mandated speech. We're used to free speech being an argument of what you can't say, less so what you must say, and the attempt there was to police language and make people refer to others in a particular way, and in its own fashion that's kind of sinister as well. 1984 is overused, but the whole idea of newspeak was to replace language and to make certain thoughts and ideas impossible to concoct or express. And that's what this kind of mandated speech is more like. It's more akin to that whole idea of newspeak, and it's kind of ass backwards trying to change opinions and ideas by policing language, rather than changing beliefs and ideas and as a result language changing, which is the more common way that these kind of things tend to happen.
It's the Newspeak Committee.
Working overtime?
Butter, 2%. Milk, 6%.
Plus big wastage is an adjective.
8%. Muscle, 3%.
Plus big problem is timing the language to scientific advance.
Pork, 3%.
Yes.
Poultry, 9%.
It's a beautiful thing, the destruction of words.
So what can we say about political correctness? It has always been a tool of suppression, diversion, oppression, a way of trying to enforce a kind of orthodoxy and a forced respect for beliefs. It has always had a negative effect on creativity, with artists, writers and poets ending up jailed for saying the wrong thing. And so that's what we're finding today. The most insidious aspect of what's going on today is that it's being stripped of context. You can look at what Count Dankula did and it's obvious and even stated that it is a joke, but that context is stripped away to the point where the mere uttering of the phrase, no matter the context, is enough. Similarly, I think there's is it Kendrick Lamar? I don't follow rap, so I don't know. Had a white girl come up on stage to sing with him. The verse happened to include the N-word, which she sang along with, and everything was brought to a halt because of it. But surely that context, an invitational onto a stage to sing a song whose lyrics include the word and was not meant as a nasty word or insult in the song, surely that is an instance in which it's okay, but apparently it's never, ever okay. So how can this possibly be considered progress? Since when has the erosion or the taking away of someone's rights and liberties been progress? It never has been. Progress is marked by increasing freedom, increasing liberty, increasing equality in what we are allowed to do and to say. So there is absolutely no defensible way in which one can say political correctness, even if you agree with it, is progressive rather than oppressive. It's also self-defeating, because I would like racists to be able to use unambiguously racist language so that I know straight away that this person is a racist and can react to them and treat them accordingly. If they're forced to use dog whistles or politically correct terms, they can still be expressing exactly the same ideas, but they're going to be more palatable to people, and they're also going to be harder for people to identify as being what they are. That doesn't strike me as progress either. That strikes me as kicking yourself in the balls. So be it resolved that what you call political correctness is the very opposite of progress. Zang.